record button. And we are now recording. Bear with me for just a second. The live students, let me introduce myself to those that are watching this recording. I'm Paul McLeod, the Minister of Education at Mount Calvary Baptist Church here in Knoxville, Tennessee. We are on session number 9, the law or laws, covenant stipulations for Israel. And we're still in the series, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Those watching the recording, thank you for coming on in. And of course, the live students, thank you so much for being here also. Well, like I said, we're going to be talking about the law, but I want to take a step back for just a minute and review session number 8. We had session number 8 last week, the parables. And our title had a question in it, do you get the point? The central idea, and what I really hoped you walked away with between the discussion, of course, and also the reading, is I hope you got the point that the parables are defined, actually calls to respond to Jesus and his mission. That is how Jesus used parables. He was calling for a response to himself and his mission. Now, to really understand parables, we got to understand the nature of the parables. The parables were defined by how Jesus used them in the Gospels. And a true parable is a story that is designed to elicit a response from the reader or the hearer, not just to illustrate a moral or principle. Parables had morals, they had principles that we could learn, but more than anything, they are designed to get a response, a reaction. It is teaching with the goal of provoking a response. Now, to differentiate parables, a parable is not an allegory, which is a story where each element in the story means something quite different than what the author intended. Now, to understand the exegesis of parables, in other words, what did it mean to the original hearer or the listeners, it's really identified by context, by key references, and by the nature of the original audience. We have to know some things about the context and the key references to understand how the parable would have been heard by the original hearers and the listeners. The key thing in a parable is to identify the catch. What do I mean by the catch? The catch is the response that shows a spiritual need. For example, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. That was a catch. Jesus would tell a parable, and the Pharisees were supposed to say, ouch. And so that was the nature of the response for that particular parable. And that's what I mean by catch. Now, to understand how do we translate the parables into our own context, how do we apply it to our own lives? First, we have to translate, we have to know what the catch is, and then we have to somehow translate that catch into our own context. And the reader and the reading in the book gave us a couple good examples of that. And so what I would like to do is just open it up to you, and I'm going to hit a button here that says ask all to unmute. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can hit that button. But what are your questions and comments from last week's discussion and from the reading from this week? If you have any questions or comments.
I have a question.
Certainly.
So I think I read this. Didn't it say that Jesus, when he gave the parable, he didn't explain what it meant himself, correct?
That wasn't the case in every parable.
Oh, okay. Because
Right.
I thought I read that he didn't really explain. He said the parable, but I thought he didn't explain every one of them or what it meant.
Right.
That it was up to you to decide if it was. I thought it was up to the person, the audience, to decide what it meant, what they thought it meant.
Right. The way you phrased it the second time you said that is correct. He didn't explain every parable. For the most part, it was up to the hearer or the reader to catch the meaning and to have the response. However, he did explain at least two parables, if I remember right. The first one that comes to mind is the parable of the four soils. You know, he said to the crowd the parable, and then he got together later with the disciples, and the disciples were like, hey, you know, what does this parable mean? And you know, Jesus even rebuked them a little and said, hey, if you don't understand this parable, how are you going to understand any of the parables? And then he explained it. He gave the meaning for each element in the parable. And so he did give a cursory explanation, but he still left some to be caught by the hearer.
So for those that were left to be caught by the hearer, how do we know exactly what he meant?
By Bible study. Yes. That's what we're by understanding. That's a good question. By the context, by the key references. Those are two that I lean on heavily. Number one is the context. If you read what was before the parable, especially what was before the parable, most of the time Jesus was answering a question. I remember Reverend Franklin doing some very good preaching on the parables. There's 2 or 3 sermons that I'm recalling right now, in which he preached and taught within context. He explained what got Jesus, or what got the story right up to that parable, and then he fit the parable right into the context to where Jesus was using that parable to answer that question. And so, to answer your question, Yvonne, how do you know exactly what it means? You have to do some reading, especially before and some after the parable, to see what was the context in which Jesus was saying that parable. And you also have to do a little Bible study on key references. What do I mean by key references? Key references are those touch points in which the original audience would have understood, but we may or may not have understood completely. For example, very easy example, again, the parable of the 4 soils. You have to kind of understand agriculture. You kind of have to understand why in the world would a seed need to get into the ground. I mean, it's a very simple example. And so most of us understand that a seed has to go into the ground and to be nurtured and have certain elements in order to grow. That's a point of reference. Without that information, without that knowledge, you're kind of lost in the parable. That kind of makes sense, Yvonne?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good question, comment. Any other questions or comments? All right, going once, going twice. So, right. Okay, well, let me introduce a few things before we watch our first video. Kind of gotten in the habit of showing you 2 videos. And I'm going to do that again. I'm going to do that again this evening because I'm just finding it such a good pairing. The main video, the main lecture, really goes in depth in some things, and the book explains some things. But I'd like for you to get an overview of the particular subject. For example, this evening, we're going to be taking a look at the law. I want you to get an overview and be comfortable with some of the terminology and to get a good overview before diving into the main lecture. And so that's why I'm showing you 2 videos. This evening, we are looking at the law. The first video will be entitled Biblical Law, and it is by the Bible Project. Gives a, it really, I like this video because it's going to help you to understand why the laws were given to ancient Israel and how they fit into the overall storyline of the Bible. And so that's really why I like this particular video. So get your devices ready. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You may have to turn up or down your device. And this video is one of those videos that starts right in on talking. Some videos, they'll have a kind of a lead in, give you a few seconds of silence or whatever. This one just starts talking. So you gotta get your ears ready. So here we go.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse, and they're found all over the second, third, fourth, and fifth books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right, and so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of two different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the seventh day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sevens?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the ideal of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right, he was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws. And he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
All right, that is our video. How about a little discussion here and I'm interested in your comments. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like. My question is, was there anything in that video that was new to you? Anything at all that was new to you?
I would say what was new is how he broke it down, those 4 points of holiness, sacrifice, justice, and sacred time. I kind of knew the rest of it, what it was saying, but to see it broken down like that makes a little bit more sense about the law.
Okay. Okay, so those categories that he was talking about, those 4 categories were new to you. Okay. Right.
He also mentioned that the Bible is not a behavioral narrative.
Right.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I had a hard time with, I've always learned that the purpose of the law is to determine when we sin. So it kind of puts some order into the lives of the Israelites and for us as well. For some reason, I must need to listen to the video again. I didn't get that out of that video.
Mhm.
That's an aha moment for me, because I always thought that the purpose of the law was to define sin when man had done something against God.
Right. Yeah, that'll come out a little more in your reading.
Okay.
You're right, Sheila. It didn't come out too much in, if at all, in the
video.
They chose to emphasize
Right.
how the law fit into the storyline, which I really appreciated. I appreciated that.
Okay.
But in your reading, you are going to read more about one of the purposes of the law is to point out sin. So yeah, you're not crazy.
Yeah, I was going to make that statement too. They did not bring that part out.
Right. What else did you all learn? Did you learn? All right. Anyone else?
Well, Paul, what I noticed about it is explaining some of the things to us about some things are determined by the laws of between Israel, what their laws were, and why they're saying the same thing doesn't apply to us sometimes as it applied to them, because it was like because of the laws that they had and some of their laws, we don't have those laws anymore. So
Right.
that was something that I saw, and I was in reading on over a little bit further. I'm going a little further too, and I was talking. They were talking about the animals and things that the law said don't eat and don't do this, and we thought it was something biblical, but it really wasn't. It was because they said he knew that some of those foods or some of the animals that were eating, they had parasites and things in them because of where they were, and they weren't really animals. So that kind of made a lot of sense to me that we got to look at the law first of what is, what the law is saying, opposed to what's going on back then, opposed to what's coming on, what's happening now, because our laws are a little bit slightly, they're different. But
Right.
what he had wrote in the Old Testament, it still goes over into the new one also, if it was written there. So anyway,
Right.
that's what I got.
Yeah, some of that will come out in the book. Yeah.
Right.
He'll have some examples of that. Okay. All right. Well, very good. All right. Well, let me introduce the video for just a second. Our main video, our lecturer is Dr. Douglas Stewart. He's going to look at how the law is the covenant stipulations of Israel and what that means for us today. He's going to help us to really understand the context of what that means, of what is a covenant, and what does that mean as far as stipulations. He's going to define that word stipulations, and he's going to do this in the context of Israel. So he's really going to help you to understand what did it mean for Israel, which is the right first step. We first have to understand what did the law or laws mean for Israel before we get into any type of application, before we think about whether we should do this Old Testament law or what does it mean to us. We have to understand what did it mean to Israel first. Now, one bit of warning, near the end, he takes a left turn and he talks about, at the very end, I think it's about the last minute, he introduces a concept called the new perspective of Paul. You can pretty much just disregard what he says. I didn't find it to be that useful, and unless you really understood what that means, a new perspective on Paul, it's a big scholarly debate about how some scholars were looking at the writings of Paul and Paul's view of the law and what he wrote about the law and how it's supposed to be applied to us. A number of years ago, about 5 to 7 years ago, was a big scholarly debate about this, and that label stuck, called New Perspective on Paul. Unless you read about 3 or 4 books on the subject or seen videos, have been introduced to this whole topic, his comments aren't going to make any sense. Okay. The first time I saw this video, and he said those comments, and then the video stopped, I was like, what is that? I mean, I had to go back to some of my notes in school to really understand what he was saying. So he says them really kind of out of context. If you don't understand anything that he says or anything, don't worry about it. Okay, don't waste any sleep on it. But I had to give you that warning because I was just flabbergasted after he said it. It's like, how in the world are we supposed to understand that? So once in a while, some professors, they'll say things that they have the context for, they understand, comes out of their mouth. Nobody understands what they say because they don't put enough context around it or lay the groundwork or the foundation. And I think this is a good example. So hopefully I wasn't too hard on him, was I? But just don't worry about it. That's my main thing. Just don't worry about it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody so we have some good sound quality. I'll share my screen, and this is Dr. Stewart, Douglas Stewart. You can tell Dr. Stewart, he likes to wear a suit. Here we go. I'm optimized.
We're going to talk now about the law, the Old Testament law. And in the chapter of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, where we talk about law, we have a subtitle for this chapter, and it's called The Covenant Stipulations in Israel. Let me unpack those three key terms. First, covenant. The Bible makes much about covenants. The Old English word testament is simply a translation of the Hebrew word berith that means covenant. A covenant is a deal. It's a contract. It's a formal arrangement made between two people, two groups, or as we sometimes say in legalese, two parties. And the Bible is covenantally oriented. God is a covenant maker, a covenant giver. He has arrangements with us. He says to us, this is what I will do for you if you will trust me, believe in me, obey me, be my people. It's a wonderful thing. It is a fabulous offer that God makes to us graciously and generously and for our benefit. Every covenant is both conditional and unconditional. Sometimes you'll hear that such and such a covenant is unconditional and such a covenant is conditional, but that's often just simplistic. Every covenant's unconditional because God makes them, and he always is faithful. He is never conditional in his promises, never conditional in what he desires and what he expects. He is sure and perfect and blameless, etc. But we're very conditional. We're humans. We may obey for a while and then fall away from obedience. We may feel good about and believe in and trust in for a while and eventually come to skepticism and so on. And God's people throughout history, certainly in the case of the Old Testament, his people Israel, were often rather flippant, often rather fickle, and often just plain selfishly disobedient. So covenant's a big part of understanding the laws, and how covenants work helps us appreciate Old Testament law. Then there's the matter of stipulations, a relatively fancy and sometimes scholarly word for the rules. What are the rules? What is actually specifically expected of people? And as you may know, Jesus takes two of the rules, the stipulations of the Old Testament covenant, love God with your whole heart, and then love your neighbor as yourself, and says, these two stipulations, these two individual laws, sum up all of the Old Testament, which he terms by the expression, the law and the prophets. That's a way, a certain kind of abbreviation for the Old Testament in general. So loving God and loving neighbor. Now, the stipulations are about those two things. It's always about loving God and or loving neighbor. And as you may know, in the New Testament, Jesus clearly defines who our neighbor is by telling that beautiful, beautiful story about the Good Samaritan, where, by the way, the concept of loving neighbor as self is clearly expressed, but the wording doesn't mention either neighbor or love. Read the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. Doesn't mention neighbor, doesn't mention love, until after the story is told, after the parable is told, Then Jesus says, who was neighbor, who loved this person as a neighbor. So it's very important to remember there's a difference between wording and concept. A lot of different words can be used to convey a given concept. And so we actually speak of the word concept fallacy when we teach biblical interpretation. When you're reading laws, in other words, be very careful to remember that it's the concept that's at stake. We'll come back to that. It's not so much the wording, though that's very important. It doesn't mean just any old wording equals any old concept, but the concept is the goal. And then finally, for Israel, God's covenant stipulations for Israel, we must remember that the old covenant is the old covenant. It's not the new covenant. In Christ, there's a new covenant that eliminates some features of the old covenant law, particularly what we would call the sacrificial law or religious procedure law, because of the enormous significance of Christ's work to make that and those processes under the general category of the procedural, religious, ritual law unnecessary. So God's covenant stipulations for Israel. A first question that everybody wonders is, how in the world can Old Testament law apply to Christians? We try to address that as well as we can in the chapter on Old Testament law, and I'm certainly going to say some things about it now to you as well. The first thing I want to say is that there's a little motto you might choose to use in connection with appreciating biblical law, and that is, no rules, no relationship. Let me repeat it. No rules, no relationship. The idea that you can have a relationship with somebody that has no rules attached is ridiculous. Even a simple, distant friendship has rules. Even a Facebook friendship has rules. There are standards, there are ways you make the friendship. You can be unfriended, you can unfriend, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are rules. They may be sort of implicit. They may be rules that you don't think a lot about, but they're always there. And close relationships have plenty of rules. A marriage in which one party or another, or maybe both the husband and wife, don't have any rules for how they relate to each other, that's a real problem relationship. And often when a relationship of any kind goes awry, it's because one person or another is no longer willing to honor the rules. Sometimes the rules are implicit, sometimes they're explicit, but no rules, no relationship. So what is the law doing? The law is not God's approach to us to say, I like to keep you under control and I want to make all kinds of limitations on your freedom and therefore on your enjoyment of life. It's just the opposite. The law first is there to establish a relationship so that our relationship with Him is genuine, true, profitable, effective, and even eternal. So these are good things. And secondly, laws are protective. Think about traffic laws. Why is there a law against running a stoplight or running a stop sign, or about speeding, or even about driving on the right side of the road? Well, if you refuse to obey those laws, you and or somebody else can get hurt or killed. Laws are protective. Laws against robbery or burglary or whatever are laws that protect somebody from somebody else or something else. Good laws protect very well, but all laws are somehow intended to be protective of freedoms, to ensure freedoms, to ensure liberties, to ensure happiness, to ensure a good life. Bad laws, of course, may not do that, but God is a good lawgiver, and his laws are intended to bring about salvation, to bring about a joyous, abundant life, and to bring about eternal relationship with him. Keep that in mind. Now, do laws from the Old Testament apply to Christians? They certainly do. First of all, they apply automatically, as it were, in the way that any part of the Word of God helps us understand who he is and what he's like and what his will is, and therefore how we might be able to conform to his will, which is something anybody who really loves God ought to want to do. In the case of the ritual laws of the Old Testament, laws that no longer apply to us, we aren't expected to sacrifice animals. We aren't expected to go to one central location 3 times a year in order to not only give sacrifices, but also to worship at a central sanctuary, which once was the tabernacle, and then eventually, after the days of Solomon, was the temple, the Old Testament temple. We aren't expected to have categories of priests and Levites who are all part of one particular ethnic group, a tribe within ancient Israel. We aren't expected to have religious leaders make medical decisions about skin diseases, and so on and so on. Those are all ritual laws, all part of the particular Old Covenant system. But the fact that those laws may not be direct commandments for us that we have to obey does not mean they don't show us a lot about God's standards. Now, it turns out that God has standards, and they are high. They are tough. One of his standards is expressed in the law: be holy as I am. If that isn't the toughest thing you've ever been assigned to do, I don't know what is. Be holy like God is holy? How could we ever meet such a standard? Well, right away, if you think it through, you're going to need help. You're going to need some kind of external righteousness to help you meet his standard. We are not instinctively, automatically, naturally, as a default position, going to be people who are holy as God is holy, as he himself is holy. So we need help. But that's a wonderful lesson to learn. We're born into a world that, as Jesus says in John chapter 10, Satan dominates. He calls him the ruler of this world. We know that, of course, from the early chapters of the Bible in Genesis, that Satan was here before we human beings showed up and was ready to tempt us and to try to take us away from God's will. This is what the Bible shows us. We're not naturally holy. We've got to have help. And that help, then, we know from our ability in this time in history to look back upon it, comes in the fullness of time with Christ's arrival, with his death on the cross and his resurrection, and now, of course, his continuing love and care for us as he is with us, every one of us, and wonderfully in us. Christ in you, the hope of glory, the Bible says. That is an incredible, wonderful thing. But the Old Covenant laws are preparing us for that. And every sacrifice that an Israelite gave when he or she came to the tabernacle or temple to bring food items as a symbolic way of having a meal with God. God says, come, have a meal with me. I'm your friend. I'm your dad, and you're my children. That situation demonstrated and led toward the understanding that God wanted to have a relationship with us, and that his rules were organized and established and described in such a way as to help us build that relationship. Now, sin is the barrier. Our sin separates us from the relationship we could have with God. How in the world do the Old Testament laws help us? The answer is they were all designed around a principle. And that is, for me to live, something that is alive must die in my place. That's the basic structure of the sacrificial system built into the laws, especially in Leviticus, but strongly in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy as well. The sacrificial system, a big part of the Old Testament law, operates on the principle, if I'm going to live, something that's alive must die in my place, and that something must not deserve to die. It must be innocent. Now, you symbolize that time after time, festival after festival, Sabbath after Sabbath, by sacrificing a little goat kid or a lamb or some other kind of animal who's innocent. The animal didn't do anything, didn't hurt anybody, didn't cause any crime or any trouble, just a little innocent animal. But that animal is sacrificed. Why? So that time after time, every ancient Israelite could get the point that I need a substitute. I'm under the penalty of death. That comes from the Garden of Eden. On the day you eat of it, you'll surely die. We're all under a death penalty. And there needs to be some mechanism, some means, some person, something by which we can get righteous. So the Old Testament law prepares us so beautifully for Christ, leads to him, points to him, and Old Testament people who were faithful to the law were always understanding that their sin had to be transferred away from them. So when you made a sacrifice, you actually put your hand on the head of the animal you were sacrificing, and then the priest would sacrifice it. And then your sins would be transferred by that symbolic act. Of course, you knew God does the transferring, but you symbolize it that way. And then the innocence of that thing sacrificed comes from God to you. So that's the wonderful thing that happens to us in something that scholars call double imputation. Our sins are imputed to Christ. He takes them and takes them away from us so that we become innocent, and his righteousness then transfers to us. So our sin goes to him by, quote, imputation. God makes the decision and makes it happen. Now, in the case of laws, we talked about stipulations and the concept. The concept involves extrapolation. Fancy word for making sure that you get the general idea and then apply it to situations other than those specifically mentioned. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus shows how this is done. He says, "You have heard it said," meaning, of course, the law itself repeated for people, "don't murder. But I tell you, if you hate somebody in your heart, if you just have a mental concept of hating somebody, that violates that commandment." Well, that's exactly how all commandments work. There are only 613 of them in the Old Testament, and you have to extrapolate from them. You have to say, this commandment mentions this thing, but anything related to it that can reasonably be seen as in the same broad orbit, the same conceptual orbit, also can apply. So he says there's a type of murder that is what we might call mental murder. It's just an idea. It's idea murder. But we hate somebody in our mind, and we want harm to come to them. That violates the commandment, don't murder. And he also says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But he said, even a person who looks at somebody else with lust is violating that commandment. That again is extrapolation. That's taking the concept and seeing it all the way out from any particular wording to the actual full range of coverage. So you do have to learn wisely to extrapolate. Jesus gives you examples of exactly how to do that in the Sermon on the Mount. And he says, in effect, the trouble is the Pharisees and Sadducees had come to the point where they stopped extrapolating because it made them feel better. See, they could say, I haven't actually committed adultery, haven't actually had sex with somebody outside marriage, so I'm innocent. And they didn't have to think in terms of their lust. They could say, I haven't killed anybody, but they could harbor hate, etc., etc., etc. And we can too. So Jesus teaches that the original way to understand all these commandments is via extrapolation. That's terribly important, and we give you more of that in the chapter on law in How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Additionally, I think it's important to appreciate there is such a thing as the law of Christ. Paul refers to that in Galatians chapter 6, the law of Christ. And various scholars have attempted to understand it, but I think the best understanding comes from those scholars, those New Testament scholars who have said, this is referring to the Old Testament law minus the sacrificial methods that no longer are necessary because the ultimate sacrificial method was finally achieved in Christ's death on the cross. So that's taken away. But laws like loving your neighbor, laws like loving God with your whole heart, laws like the Ten Commandments and so on, all of those ethical principles, all of those things that are not strictly linked only to the Old Covenant, those still apply. That's the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is not just one little idea or something. We really still benefit from and are richly informed by and have the rules of Old Testament law help us gain a relationship to God. Now, with regard to covenant, covenants had more than just stipulations. An ancient covenant typically had 6 parts, and you can see that in Deuteronomy, if you want to see it in that location. You can see it in Exodus 20 through the end of Numbers, if you want to see it in that location in the Mosaic Law. There's a preamble telling you about relationships. There's a prologue telling you about relationships. I'm the Lord. I brought you out of Egypt, God says to his people. You're my people. There are the stipulations. Then there are sanctions, blessings and curses, carrots and sticks, incentives for keeping the relationship, not losing it, explaining how you could lose it. Don't do these things. These will break the relationship. There is a list of witnesses. God says, look, ultimately, all of creation, all of heaven and earth are watching you. Do you understand? And of course, he names himself as the ultimate witness. I am witness against you this day, says the Lord. And then finally, there's even provision for writing down the covenant, which of course Moses did in great detail as God inspired him to get it all perfect the way it should be. We are really blessed by a whole bunch of writing in legal form that tells us what the rules are for the relationship and how God's standards are high, but his mercy is great. There's a little bit of fun that I want to have in the last minute of this lecture in talking about something called the New Perspective on Paul. You may have heard about it. It gets blown out of the water by a Dead Sea Scroll. A Dead Sea Scroll with the fancy name 4QMMT tells us that the works of the law are all sorts of things, anything from the little to the large. The New Perspective on Paul said, when Paul says works of the law, he's only referring to Sabbath keeping and eating kosher and circumcision. No, it's the whole package. They're all good. They're all good for us. We are not under that covenant in every single instance in terms of having to obey each of those ritual laws or the sacrifices or whatever. But all of them remain the Word of God for us to build that relationship, to show us what it needs to be, to show us what it means to be holy, and to drive us to Christ, who alone can make us holy.
All right, that's our main lecture by Dr. Stewart. Interested in your comments and questions about that particular video. Was there something that you had learned, or did something pop out at you, or what were the one or two things that really stood out to you in that video?
For me, he used the word extrapolate a lot.
Mm-hmm. You like that word.
He liked that word, and I'm not sure how I received that.
Sounds like you didn't like it.
I'm just not sure. Because he's telling us to pull out what we want. And I think that when God gave the law, then the whole purpose is to build relationship with him, which is what he was saying. And then he's saying that we today should extrapolate from it. And I think the whole purpose too is, I've always learned the purpose of the law was to define sin and to tell us to be holy. In other words, to be like God. God pretty much in the Old Testament told the Israelite in if and then statements, if you do this, then this would happen, you know. So I don't get what is there to extrapolate, because what the rules that Moses gave them were pretty clear. And then he did the curses if you didn't do it, you know. So I didn't get the extrapolation part for the Old Testament. Yeah. And I certainly don't get it for the new one. So yeah, that's something I have to wrap my mind around to figure out, okay, what is he saying? Maybe I need to see that video again, because
in the book, it's explained more fully. He gave you just basically an outline of what he's talking about, and the whole model, the whole context of using that word extrapolation was the Sermon on the Mount, and exactly what Jesus did when he said, "You've heard it said, but I say." Jesus was taking the narrow definition of a law and extrapolating it to a broader sense, having to do with the heart, basically. And so in the book, it will you know, put some flesh on that. It will put some meat on that. And certainly, if you don't get it after the reading, please write down, you know, a couple questions or whatever. And I think that'd be a good discussion for next week. But yeah,
because for me, Jesus, what he brought was the gospel. He brought a different concept, not necessarily extrapolating it, you know. He brought something new and different in terms of of the new covenant. In other words, he was bringing in a new covenant. So he brought in the you're losing the term that I needed. I need to explain.
Okay.
What it was different, but it wasn't extrapolating. I don't see it. But again, once I read the lesson, maybe I can.
Yeah, take a look at the chapter and see if it makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What else did you all, what popped out at you?
The statement was made, God is never conditional. And when we think of Deuteronomy, where we have the curses and the blessings,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I fully understood, the statement that he was making. God is never conditional.
Conditional. Mhm.
Right. Yeah, I've actually looked at the video at least twice, maybe three times. And he does make that statement. And I'm not quite sure. He doesn't put enough around it to really explain what he means by that. So I'm trying to remember the reading also. And I don't remember that being a major point of the book. So I kind of jotted it down and kept on going.
Yeah, because that conditional sounds like he doesn't give us a choice. He calls us to do things, but he still gives us a choice, even though God does have an ultimate plan that he does follow.
Right.
But yeah.
So
I didn't follow that either. And the reading, would definitely help to help.
Yeah, but the reading, I don't remember that being fleshed out in the reading. So I kind of moved on from it and considered it maybe a minor point that he made. And if he talked about it more, maybe it makes sense. But I don't have much to grab onto, so I guess I kept it moving.
Yeah. He kind of made a lot of statements that I thought, okay, I need to look at that again.
All right. Anyone else? What jumped out at you?
Paul, I thought, still speaking of him saying that God was unconditional, I thought he said that he was unconditional in what he said he would do and what he might have promised and all that. I don't think I didn't get that he was talking about conditions according to what we do, because he also said that we are unconditional. But I thought he was saying in what God said he would do and what he promised and what on that vein, I thought he was talking about him being unconditional.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'd have to look at it another time to really understand what he was saying about that. Yeah, but I think you're right, Rodney. There was something about we're conditional or we're unconditional. I kind of got the terms mixed up, so I'd have to go back and take a look at that. But one thing, go ahead, Mary.
I think there were a lot of points that just I didn't quite grasp what he was saying, and I probably will understand it better once I read. Because I was just kind of muddling along, trying to absorb some of what he was saying. But one of the things that he mentioned was that laws are established to be protective. I did grasp that. That was right out there. But some of the other, concepts or things he was saying, I couldn't really grasp. So I'm going to be doing some serious reading.
Well, at least you've heard the terminology. You've heard some of the vocabulary and kind of got warmed up to it. So hopefully that's created some buckets in your mind that when you do the reading, some of that information can go in those buckets and you can make sense of it. So, and that's the whole, really that's the whole idea of the video, is not for you to get complete understanding. In other words, after the video, oh yeah, I understand everything. It's to introduce you to the concepts, to introduce you to the vocabulary, so that when you do the reading, then it adds a little framework, a little structure to what you're going to be reading. And so it's kind of more or less an introduction. But that's good that, Mary, that you picked up on that. The law is protective. And we see that throughout the law. He loves the people of Israel so much, he surrounded them with not only his love and his provision, but also his law. And he loved them that much. Imagine if you had a child, or let's imagine that you had a relative. Let's say one of your cousins has a child, and that couple decided to let their child, a young girl, do whatever she wanted. If she wanted to jump on the bed, if she wanted to play in traffic, if she wanted to play with knives, if she, whatever she wanted to do, whatever she felt like doing, no rules, no law in that house. To me, that doesn't sound very loving, because they're not taking her concern, her safety into their minds. And I think God so loved the people of Israel that he gave them the law, his law. Yeah. Okay. Well, we got
he kind of, I was just going to say, I think he explained it when he said his, it wasn't a motto, but it was something when he said, no rules, no relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty good. I remember that.
I like that when he says, because that's true. It fits everything. If you want a relationship there, and with no rules, there's really no.
Right. Yeah, that resonated me, especially being married.
Me too.
Especially being married, I kind of got with that. I mean, that was perfect for me. I understood that. And no explanation for me on that one. So, yeah. Let me mention one thing before I give a little summary and we can start closing it up. In your book, if you would take your book, if you have it handy, and you'll see on the very last page of your reading on page 186, you can dog ear. I like dog earing. I've been told that it's wrong to treat a book that way. But anyway, you can dog ear or mark or whatever you want. That particular page, I found that to be especially useful. And in fact, I wish this page was at the beginning of the chapter and not the end. But you may want to look at page 186 before you read the chapter. You don't have to go through and understand every word or every concept, but just get those 12 points in your mind before you read, and that might help you to grab on to some of what the chapter is talking about. So just mark or dog ear page 186, whatever you'd like to do with that. I think that would help. Well, wonderful. Some good comments, some good questions. In summary, let me just make 4 points in summary. A lot of information in this session, but the first thing to understand in summary is that the Old Testament laws are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Two parties here, God and Israel, and that these are the law are the stipulations for that agreement. So look at that and understand that you're not in the middle of that, unless you're Jewish. Then that kind of complicates things, being Jewish in the New Testament age, but that's a different conversation. But that's what it is. You've got two parties here, God and Israel. The second thing is that the Old Testament laws were a generous gift to Israel. It wasn't meant to be a burden to the point where this over-controlling God, this mean God, is putting all these laws in effect to control Israel. But it was a generous gift to Israel. The third thing is that the Old Testament laws are not written to you, but they are written for you. So you may want to think about that this week. The Old Testament laws were not written to you, but they are written for you. And we can talk about that after you read the chapter and explode that, expand that a little. And the last thing is that the Old Testament laws are not binding on Christians, except were specifically renewed. The Old Testament laws are not binding on Christians, except where specifically renewed. Now, does that mean they're unimportant? No, that's not what I'm saying. The Old Testament laws are really, really important, not for salvation, but for 2 or 3 specific reasons, and you'll read about those, but they are not binding. I'm talking specifically about having authority over you. They're not binding on you, except we're specifically renewed in the New Testament. All right, so that is our session for this evening. I will leave the Zoom session open. If you want to fellowship or have a question or a comment you'd like to ask, maybe in a smaller group. The reading for this week, of course, is chapter 9, is session 9, the law or laws, covenant stipulations for Israel. Hold up for just a second, live students. Let me say goodbye to our recording students. Thank you so much for pushing some buttons and joining us. I really hope the videos have helped you. I want to encourage you to go ahead and get the book. Think about joining us. You can get the information in our office if you want to join us live. So thank you. Thank you so much.